Again, welcome. I'm Mark Herzl of American Honda Motor Company, and it's my privilege as the second vice president and chair of the programs committee of your Foreign Trade Association to introduce to you today's webinar. The Foreign Trade Association webinars coming up in the next few weeks and months will be on December 8th, getting to know the centralized examination stations of LA Long Beach and how to keep your cargo moving through the process. We'll have a roundtable with representatives from all three CES sites. On December 17th, we're going to have Dr. Noel Hasagaba be our featured speaker for our virtual holiday event. Get it? Noel and holiday. And he's going to be talking about the logistical benefits of the Bridge to Everywhere, the new bridge built to replace the Gerald Desmond Bridge. Also at that event, we'll be releasing the name and revealing the name of the winner of the Marjorie Shostak Award. So certainly encourage you to join us for that. January 8th, we have KPMG doing a webinar on forced labor in today's global trade environment. And also in late January, we anticipate having a group on webinar on emerging technologies and blockchain in logistics. So if you find these topics of interest and you're not already a member of the Foreign Trade Association to enjoy the special FTA member pricing on the events, we are offering a 50% discount on corporate and one company representative memberships for new members from now until the end of December. So corporate membership that's regularly $300 or is regularly $600 is now $300, and individual that's regularly $300 is now $150. So to qualify as a new member, you've got to be at least an 18-month lapse since your previous membership, or an individual who's left a company who previously was a member. So as the attorneys remind us, other conditions and restrictions apply. So give us a call, let us know, and we'd love to get you signed up. A couple of housekeeping notes. First, to let you know that all attendees are being placed in listen-only mode, and we would ask that you keep your cameras off. If you have any question for today's speakers, we ask that you type it in the chat box, and we'll look at those at the end of the presentation. So today's presentation is sponsored by Braumiller Law Group, founded by Miss Adrienne Braumiller, with offices through the US and Mexico. They have experts in import, export, drawback, foreign trade zones, Mexican trade law, USMCA, and other areas of international trade. And one of those experts is Mr. Bruce Leeds. Prior to becoming an attorney, Bruce was an import specialist at U.S. Customs in Los Angeles for 7 years. Then he joined Hughes Aircraft, where he supervised a team of 27 employees managing import and export documentation, compliance and licensing functions, and establishing policies and procedures, doing compliance investigations and all sorts of stuff there. He later joined Hughes Space and Communications Company and the Boeing Company, and served in export-import compliance positions. Bruce is also a U.S. Army veteran. So Bruce has held a number of prestigious leadership positions over the years and continues to do so. He's a board member and past president of the Foreign Trade Association, as well as the chair of Women in International Trade Los Angeles. He's on the board of governors for American Association of Exporters Importers, and a member of the International Compliance Professionals Association, the ICPA. And also the Society for International Affairs. With an undergrad from Cal State LA and a JD from West Los Angeles School of Law, he's also a certified customs specialist and a licensed customs broker. If you've not yet previously had the privilege to hear Bruce speak, you are in for a treat. Bruce, with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks. Now I have to live up to that introduction. Darn.
Oh, you will.
Okay. Thanks to modern technology, I'm doing the webcast today from the beach on Bora Bora in my dreams. So here is what we're going to be covering today. This is about the recently announced customs plan to require continuing education for customs brokers. So if you have a license this is going to affect you. This is an individual thing, I might point out. As far as customs broker companies, they get licenses too. This would affect them only indirectly, in that they have to have at least one officer who has a license. And that officer is going to have to go out and get educated. All right, so we're going to talk about where did this proposal come from, and a bit about the Federal Register notice. What are the current requirements, or maybe a lack of requirements, for education for customs brokers? How many hours are they talking about you requiring? What kind of classes would you be having to take, or where do you find these classes? How to record what training you've had, and how and when do you report that to customs? And the other question is, well, what if you don't meet the continuing education requirement? Then what? Okay, and then there'll be different training companies and government agencies and what have you, all offering training. How do they get accredited? In other words, what training is customs recognize? And conversely, maybe what won't they recognize? And if you have read the Federal Register notice, or go and look it up, and you see this proposal and you've got thoughts on how it ought to be carried out, how do you get feedback in there, and how do you get your comments and suggestions, or maybe your suggestion is go take a hike or whatever it is, how do you do it? And then after the current Federal Register notice has gone in and the comments have gone in, what happens after that? So that's some of the stuff we'll be covering in the next little while. Okay, right now, if you're a licensed customs broker, you've got to do a triennial report every 3 years. That's what that means, triennial. And if you have a permit, then you have to go renew your permit and pay whatever fees are associated with those things. But there's no requirement out there to show that you are active and competent and you're keeping up with all the changes of the regulations and procedures and keeping up with the 232 and the 301 duties and all the other stuff. Now, there are a lot of professions out there. I'm, of course, a member of the California Bar Association, and I've got a triennial continuing education requirement, and that's been in existence since day one. And so I'm familiar with that. If you're a doctor or a nurse, and many other professions have a continuing education requirement so that people can keep up with all the changes, regulations and procedures and what have you. Now, why hasn't customs had a requirement like that? Well, one problem, and I've heard them say this out loud, is they say, well, if we started a continuing education program, we've got to staff it and we got to manage the whole program, and that's going to require more people. We have no money in our budget for doing that. And sounds like a government excuse, but it's a legitimate excuse. They don't have it. If they were to start a continuing education program and staff it up, that means they may have to take personnel from other places. Well, even the way it's proposed, they will have to staff it to a certain amount, but you're also going to see how they propose to outsource it. Okay, there are other organizations, and the one that comes to mind, National Customs Brokers and Freight Forwarders Association. That association has CCS certification, Certified Customs Specialist certification. There's a also certified export certification that you can get. And that program has continuing education requirements associated with it. All right, now, on October 28th in the Federal Register, and you can go just look that up online if you want to find out where it is. Just Google it. Federal Register, October 28, 2020, it'll come up with that Federal Register. It's going to have all these announcements from all the different government agencies. But one of them, it'll be under Department of Homeland Security, because that's who Customs belongs to. There's the docket number. They published what's called an Advanced Notice of Proposed Rulemaking. What is that all about? When they say advanced notice, they say we're getting ready to go out there and put a proposed rulemaking out there, but we're going to give you an advance warning that this is coming and what's going to be in it. Now, proposed rulemaking will be what follows this. That'll be, they're going to publish proposed regulations, and line by line, they're going to publish proposed regulations, and you can take a look at that and comment on it, et cetera, et cetera. So this is really giving you a heads up. It's also giving you a chance to see what they're proposing and submit your recommendations and your thoughts on how it ought to work. And one thing, if you look at this notice, throughout the notice, the agency is soliciting input from the public. They said, here's what we're thinking about doing. What do you think we ought to do? Or how do you think this ought to go? So it gives you a chance to really get public input on this. Okay. Where did this idea come from? Once they decided that they ought to have continuing education. In fact, this is an idea that's been kicking around for many years. I know when I taught customs brokerage in the past, commented that you could work at a company and have a licensed broker there, and that broker could be in an auto accident and be totally brain damaged. And as long as somebody submitted trying to report on behalf of that individual and renewed any permits and all that kind of stuff, that person would still have their license. And people think, well, maybe that's not right. Maybe I make sure that the person there is conscious and up to speed on all the latest, greatest regulations. All right. So what Customs did and to flesh out this concept was go to the Commercial Operations Advisory Committee. If you're not familiar with COAC, I'm a former member of COAC myself, and it's made up of 20 industry members. There's brokers, there are importers, there's attorneys, and what have you are on the COAC committee. And they advise Customs and the commissioner on different programs, either proposing programs or commenting and analyzing programs that Customs is coming up with. Okay, so it's an interesting committee to be on, and it's a resource actually that Customs goes to. And what Customs did is they went to the COAC committee, to the Rapid Response Subcommittee of the COAC, and said, you need to help us put together a continuing education program. And the subcommittee then had its own members, and typically a COAC subcommittee is going to have at least 5 committee members are going to be on it, but then they went out to the trade and they contacted different experienced licensed customs brokers and said, can you participate in this committee? We need your input on this. And similar to when I was on the COAC committee, we had a subcommittee to advise on the 10+1 proposal, the advanced notice. Okay, and so we put together a subcommittee. At what point it had more than 30 members of it. We went out and got folks who work for NVOCCs and freight forwarders and shipping lines, etc., who might be interested in the 10+2 proposal. I went and discounted it by 1. And we solicited input from all those folks and went back to Customs and said, here's how we think this thing needs to be rolled out. And here's how we think the regulations ought to read. And to a large extent, they followed our recommendations. And the same thing is going on here. The committee had deliberations, probably had a bunch of meetings, some virtual. I guess nowadays, all of them virtual. And the subcommittee came up with recommendations. And so this advanced notice of proposed rulemaking is based on those recommendations. So there's the whole process to get to this point. Okay, now the basic proposal is this. If you're a licensed broker, you have a requirement to complete 40 hours of continuing education over a 3-year period. Incidentally, it's very similar to the state bar's requirement, and there's probably other professions have a similar requirement. And CBP's thinking was that more than 40 hours would be a burden. You'd have brokers out there having to take a whole mess of classes, and that would interfere with them being brokers. And less would not be enough to keep them up to speed. So they've kind of settled on that 40 hours, but CBP, and this is typical of this advanced notice of proposed rulemaking, they're asking the trade, is 40 hours the right number of hours? Is that appropriate? And should more or less hours be required? If so, how many hours? And so if you have thoughts on that, they're encouraging you to submit your thoughts. All right. So what kind of training would qualify towards the 40 hours? Well, first thing the Federal Register notice pointed out is that CBP does a lot of webinars, and no more, at least for the time being, no more in-person training, but they do offer a lot of webinars. That would all count. Other government agencies oftentimes offer training on subjects that touch on import requirements. For example, there's some of the agencies up there: Agriculture, Food and Drug, Environmental Protection, Consumer Product Safety Commission. There are several agencies that have requirements that touch on imports. And so if they offer training and that training is relevant to brokers and importing, then that training would also count. For example, if Food and Drug put on a webinar on how to import frozen shrimp, then that would count, especially if you're a broker and some of your clients imported frozen shrimp. And the notice also mentioned other potential training. They're not saying this counts yet, but they're saying these are examples of what possibly could count. One of which is corporate training, that within a corporation, oftentimes the company that has a large company has a large import staff, might offer internal training for its employees. When I was at Boeing, we had internal training for our customs compliance staff and for export compliance staff. And now for the import compliance training, we would then go to the National Brokers Association and ask if that could count towards the certified customs specialist requirement. And typically it did. So in customs brokers associations, whether they're regional or local or nationwide, they also offer training. I got an email today from the NCB FAA saying we're doing a webinar on such and such and such and such. So that potentially could qualify too. But when I say all this other training, non-government training, potentially could qualify, is it's going to have to be accredited before it could possibly qualify. We're going to talk about accreditation shortly, so hang in there. All right. So CBP is asking from the advice from the trade whether other training could qualify. For example, internal training conducted by customs brokers. So they're trying to expand the field of what training could possibly be qualified towards that 40-hour requirement. Many brokers, especially the larger brokers, will have internal training for their staff. So perhaps every import person who works at a customs broker company has to have 10 hours of internal training a year. Does that count? Well, maybe it could. Now, they brought up another issue, and that is the issue, what if you work for a customs broker in, I don't know, Great Falls, Montana, or Eagle Pass, Texas, some place that's not a major metropolitan area where the training may be a little bit more difficult to find. So what about brokers in remote areas? Can they get 40 hours training a year? Would web-based or third-party training where perhaps a broker in Great Falls, Montana brings in a trainer to train their staff, does that count? So they're asking the trade for this, for feedback on that. What could qualify? Or maybe if you're in a remote border crossing like that or a remote airport, should you still be required to do 40 hours or could it be reduced? So these are some areas where if you have thoughts and suggestions on this front, go look at the Federal Register notice. It'll tell you where you can submit your advice. All right. Is training limited to international trade subjects only? Well, here's CBP's current recommendation, the current thinking on this, that of the 40 hours, at least 75% or 30 hours would have to focus on customs business and CBP operational and process requirements. So you could, your 30 hours could be on tariff classification, it could be on dumping duties, it could be on ACE and ACE reporting, it could be on CES procedures, all that other kind of stuff that's customs operational and process requirements. And The other 10 hours could be on maybe food and drug requirements or CPSC requirements. That's just their current thinking, but they're asking for feedback on this. CBP requests input on proposed requirement and whether there should be specific areas of training. In other words, of your 40 hours, should there be a requirement that at least 10 hours be on tariff classification or 5 hours on valuation, etc., or could the 40 hours be anything that fits within a general description, customs business and CBP operational process requirements. So they are looking for input on this as to would they be a requirement for a certain number of hours of training on certain subjects, and beyond that you can do whatever you want. For example, with the state bar, when I have to satisfy their continuing education requirements, pretty much it's all on just legal subjects, but they do require a certain number of hours on prevention of discrimination and on ethics. And though you have to meet those hours. Does this apply to all customs brokers? If you have a broker's license, pretty much the answer is yes. All licensed brokers must meet the requirement, no matter how long the broker has held a license. Whether the broker is conducting customs business, they could be many people pass the broker's exam and get their license, but they don't practice brokerage. Maybe they're doing something else for a living. I know several people who have broker's licenses who went into export controls, so they're not doing customs business at all. Should they have to meet this requirement? And you also have to meet the requirement, this is customs thinking right now, whether brokers are a sole proprietor, that you own your own brokerage business, or whether you're an employee or an officer of a customs brokerage. With all these things would not be factors. If you hold a license, you have to meet the requirement. And one thing, and let me just go back a page here on the 40 hours. What if you've only been a broker for 1 year? You got your license a year ago. Do you still have to meet a 40-hour requirement? I read through the Federal Register notice. I didn't see that mentioned at all. I would rather imagine they would have to prorate it in some manner, because you're going to see the report on continuing education is due once every 3 years on the same date as the triennial report is due. Okay, one other thing to talk about here. There may be brokers who voluntarily suspend their license. There are licensed brokers who say, for the time being, I'm not going to be using my license. I want to have it suspended. So they're going to have a different set of education requirements. At least this is the recommendation from the agency. If you have a voluntarily suspended license, why would you want to do that? Well, maybe you want to be like me and living on the beach in Bora Bora, right? So once again, in your dreams, it's a person who holds a customs broker's license who is now serving in the military, or there are licensed brokers who incidentally go to work for the government. A woman I dealt with when I was on the COAC committee, she was a CBP employee. She was a licensed broker who stopped being a licensed broker and joined the administration, and that's fine too. Okay, so that could cause somebody to want to suspend their license voluntarily. While the license is being suspended voluntarily, there is no continuation requirement. So as long as you're living on the beach in Bora Bora, you don't have to do any education requirements, and you don't have to submit any reports. Cool. However, they get tired of living on the beach and you move back to states and you want to reinstate your license. When you reinstate your license, now every 3 years with a triennial report, you have to submit your continuing education report. Okay. And CBP finally asked for any thoughts from the industry, thoughts from the trade, thoughts from the brokerage. If there's any thoughts out there, are there any licensed brokers who maybe do not have to meet this requirement? And all I can think of, if somebody was sick in the hospital and unable to take training, maybe that's somebody who doesn't have to submit the education education requirement. Okay. All right. How do you track your education? You're out there taking classes and getting certificates, I hope. So you're doing all that. How do you track it? In other words, how do you document what training you've had so that if they were to ask, you could say, I completed 40 hours and here's what the 40 hours consisted of. And CBP says, we have no specific recommendation in this area, but you could like do an Excel spreadsheet, do it that way. And there may be some tracking software where you could track how many hours of training you've had. And another experience I had from my Boeing days is we had an internal requirement for continuing education. And there was tracking software that documented at least all the internal classes. And I think you could also add external classes into the tracking software. So that works. So the triennial report is due once every 3 years. And I think it's another year or so, we have to do another triennial report. You pay $100 at that time. Okay, the continuing education report would be done at the same time. And in the Federal Register notice, CBP said they thought there could be a mechanism in ACE where you just simply check a box. There'd be an ACE report and you check a box and it says, I completed my continuing education requirement. You could also submit a hard copy. If you're doing your triennial report in hard copy, you could accompany it with another hard copy document saying, yeah, I completed my education requirement. You notice they're saying you just check a box or you submit a hard copy document saying I completed my requirement. At this stage, they're not asking you to actually submit a report on what classes you took and how many hours each one. You simply say, yeah, I met the requirement. And I'll just say, once again, with the state bar, that's exactly what they do. You check a box when you pay your dues. Okay. Now, what will customs do? If all people are doing is checking a box, submitting statements saying, I completed my requirements, is that the end of the story? CBP proposed to do a 10% random sample. So they're going to take all the reports came in from all the brokers throughout the country, and 10% of them will be called out. They'll contact those 10% and say, okay, give us the details. So submit a report to us telling us how many hours you had and what classes they were and all that kind of stuff. So if you were in the lucky 10%, you would have to go out and submit a complete report. Now, so down the bottom, I asked some questions. What if the broker is selected that 10% and they don't respond? What if the triennial report goes in and the broker did not check the box in ACE or submit a hard copy report or whatever they're doing? What if they didn't do that? What if they are in the lucky 10% and customs does an audit of them and turned out they only did 20 hours during that period of time, not 40? What if they made a false statement? They said, oh yeah, I did 40 hours. It turns out it wasn't true. They can't back it up. Now, stay tuned. We're going to the dark side of this and showing what happens to the bad guys, the non-reporters. Okay. Hey, what if no report is made to CBP because they didn't check the box or submit a hard copy or whatever method is being used to say, yeah, I completed the education requirement? CBP is looking at two options for how they're going to deal with that situation. CBP is also soliciting input from the trade on what would be appropriate disciplinary actions for failure to report or failure to meet the requirement. Now, also says the bottom bullet down there, CBP will work with the broker having temporary extenuating circumstances affecting their ability to obtain education hours. I was in the hospital with COVID-19 for a while and I couldn't do my education. Okay, they'll work with you on that one if that was the case. Or I broke my leg or whatever the deal was, where you had extenuating circumstances where you could not meet the requirement. Let them know and they'll work with you. So that's good. Said CBP has two options they're contemplating for what happens to brokers who do not check the box and indicate they met the education requirement. Here's option one. CBP will send, if they don't get a report from the broker, maybe the broker did not check the box, they did not send anything hard copy or whatever method they're doing to say, yeah, I met the requirement, or they're in the lucky 10% called out to submit a report showing what training they had and how many hours they had, and the person didn't do that. Now what happens? Well, first thing CBP will do is send a warning letter to the broker. Dear broker, we didn't see a report from you, or a report we got from you, there was nothing on it. Okay, so the broker can reply with evidence they met the requirement. So CBP contacts the broker, says, broker, we didn't get a report from you that you had met this at continuing education hours. And the broker responds with evidence that they did meet the requirement. So you give them the full spreadsheet showing all the classes they took, the topics of the classes, and who presented them, and how many hours, all that stuff. They get that. Okay, you're good. You're not suspended or anything like that. You're good. You've met the requirement. The broker does not reply with evidence they met the requirement. So Customs contacts the broker, said, you didn't check the box, or you were in the 10% and it turned out you didn't get any hours or whatever it was. If they did not meet the requirement, then the broker's license is suspended. They're not going to be a broker until they get things worked out. The broker still does not comply with the education requirement. The license is revoked by operation of law. When you see that expression in the regulations, by operation of law, it means it happens automatically. So if you don't meet the requirement and you can't prove you met the requirement, you have no license, revoked. Here's option number two that's being contemplated. Under this option, Customs use the same procedure for brokers who do not submit a triennial report. If the report is not made by March 31st of the reporting year, so you got to do your triennial report, and you're also going to have to tell Customs you met the continuing education requirement. If they don't do that by March 31st of the reporting year, CBP would respond to the broker with written notice that their license is being suspended because they did not submit a report. The broker has 60 days to file a complete report. That would mean, here's all the classes I took and how many hours and what the subject matters and who gave them to me and all this other stuff. If they do that, then their license is no longer suspended, they're reinstated. If they do not do that, license revoked by operation of law. So those are the two options they're looking at. CBP is asking the trade for which one of those do you like, or is there some other way to deal with this? Ooh, false or misleading support. Okay, if broker self-certification was false or misleading, respect to any material fact, it would be a violation. As an example, they certify that, yeah, we met the requirements. So CBP, maybe they're in the 10% or CBP has suspicions or whatever the case may be, and they say, okay, give us the full report on all the classes you had and all the hours and the subjects and who provided the training and that kind of stuff. And it turned out it was false or misleading. Maybe they had no training. Maybe the train didn't count, or not enough hours, or they exaggerated everything to get enough hours. That would result in suspension or revocation of license, or an assessment of a monetary penalty, or some combination of these. So they hit you with a penalty and take away your license. It may depend on the severity of things. This is another area where CBP is asking for feedback on, like, okay, what should happen to people who do these things? How do we kind of encourage them to play it straight and narrow? All right. Going to jump over to the subject. I brought up this word before, accreditation. The first challenge I had on dealing with accreditation is making sure I spelled that correctly. But anyway, accreditation means qualifying training counting towards a requirement. A training company, we'll call them ABC Customs Training. And ABC Customs Training, they do classes that are offered to brokers and the importers and all that kind of stuff. So they are a third-party training provider. All right. Does their training count towards the requirement? Well, it will count if they're accredited. Okay, and there's other training that fall into the same category: third-party providers, attending conferences, trade associations, that kind of stuff. They all do training. Would that all count? If you go to the ICPA conference and you do all the import tracks, so that's going to be like 20 hours right there. So does that going to count? So first of all, training provided by Customs and Border Protection and other relevant U.S. government entities is automatically accredited. So if you take a webinar from CBP or a webinar on importing food products offered by Food and Drug Administration, that's automatically accredited towards your 40-hour requirement. And I would say just keep a record of what training, what webinar you attended, what agency presented it, and what it was on, and any receipt or anything else they gave you. Keep all that stuff, because you may need it to show that, yeah, you did take that training. Then CBP goes on to say it's currently not in a position to accredit training provided by non-government entities. So ABC Import Training Company wants to have its training accredited. Well, CBP says, sorry, we're not in that business. We can't accredit you. Instead, that has to be accredited by other means, and that means outsourcing it. So let's talk about outsourcing accreditation. CBP proposes that private entities could be selected to serve as accreditors. In other words, could be trade associations. It could be could even be a broker, I suppose. Or it could be, although that might be sort of a conflict of interest. It could be a law firm. Could be all kinds of folks out there. Private entities could be accredited to serve as accreditors. Great. How do they become accreditor? A proposed method being from CBP. Right now, they have what's called the request for information method. If any of you worked in procurement in the past, you're familiar with what an RFI is all about. But let's say CBP is out, they want to buy a bunch of computers for their employees. Well, the first step in that process may be to send out a request for information to all the qualified suppliers of computers. And in the RFI, they'll ask a bunch of questions such as, can you provide the following kind of computers? Here's what the schedule looks like. Can you meet that schedule? Do you meet all the federal government procurement rules, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? Okay, so they're suggesting the same method for selecting accreditors. So if you want to become an accreditor, you're a training company and you want to become an official accreditor, like I mentioned before, ABC Import Training Company. Let's say ABC wants to become an official accreditor. Customs would send an RFI saying we're requesting information on parties that like to become accreditors. And ABC would then respond to it saying, yeah, I want to become an accreditor for continuing education. And there's going to be some information they have to provide that goes along with that. But their first thing would be respond to the RFI. And that would be all published in the Federal Register saying, if you want to become a continuing education accreditor, here's what you have to do, blah, 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 blah. You read the fine print. And selected accreditors could then approve training for credit towards continuing education. So if ABC Import Training Company gets appointed as accreditor, they could then go out and approve non-government classes and organizations and companies, etc., as accreditors, and they could collect a fee for doing that. So that's how that would work. Now, if you or your organization would like to become an accreditor, or the example I gave, ABC Import Training Company would like to become an accreditor, there's actually in the Federal Register, there's a whole page of requirements. But here are some of the key requirements that they would have to satisfy. There's one key official holding an individual broker's license, a list of professional references for the company and probably for the officers of that company or the people doing the training, resumes of the key personnel involved in coursework. So if you have people who work for the company who develop relevant training, they'd want to see resumes of those people to show what their background and experience is. Okay, demonstrated knowledge of trade laws, regulations, and customs business. So the firm that wants to become an accreditor would have to show, yeah, here's how we know what customs laws and procedures and customs business are all about. description of the criteria the accreditor would use to evaluate training to qualify for the continuing education. So if companies go to ABC Import Training, which is now an approved accreditor, companies come to them and say, we'd like this course to be qualified for towards a continuing education requirement. Well, how would ABC Import Training Company, what process would they use to accredit that training or that provider? Okay, and CBP anticipates there be ultimately 5 or 10 approved accreditor entities out there. Maybe more, maybe less. They're not saying there should be less than so many or more than so many. They're not setting the limit. They're going to see what happens. And approved accreditors cannot self-approve their own training. So if you got ABC Training Company is out there doing import training for brokers and importers and whatnot, they can't approve their own training. They would have to go to another approved accreditor to get that training approved. And CBP is not going to get involved with what kind of fee the accreditor would charge for its services. That'd be non-regulated. That's up to the approved entity itself. All right, so there is the summary of the proposal. If you want all the fine print, it's about, golly, at least a 6-page document in, I would say, size 8 or 10 font. It's pretty small, so get out your reading glasses. So, but this is a summary, what's in there. If you go read the actual document, it's got a lot of information in there, and often throughout the whole document, the agency is asking for feedback, asking for suggestions, asking what people think about this requirement and the ways they're proposing to carry it out. The next step in this process, they're going to get input, they're going to get suggestions, recommendations from the trade, and they're all due, I think, by the end of this month. And so they're going to get all those comments and suggestions and what have you, and they're going to digest all that information. And then the next thing to happen, and I would expect this probably won't be until June of next year or so, they'll come out with a proposed notice of rulemaking. That's kind of, I made that redundant, didn't I? Proposed notice, proposed rulemaking. Well, you can eliminate one of the proposals there. And they'll come out with another federation notice with a notice of proposed rulemaking, which they'll have draft regulations on continuing education for customs brokers. I don't know whether that would appear in Part 111, which deals with customs brokers, or whether they have a separate part dealing with this subject. But you would see when you see the notice of proposed rulemaking. And then, in response to the notice of proposed rulemaking, the trade can go back and submit, once again, their recommendations and suggestions and criticisms and what have you. And then about, I would say at least 6 months after that, we're talking about a year from now, a minimum a year from now, there'll be a final rule published with an implementation date. And effective on that date, you have to go out and start getting educated and comply with the requirement. So what if you want to submit comments to this proposed or advanced proposed rulemaking? Okay, you don't have to be a broker to do this. You don't even have to be a citizen to do this. Anyone can submit comments. It's individuals, associations, companies, all those different parties can submit comments and feedback suggestions. You just have to be a member of the public. And comments are due by December 28th of this month. So you got 4 weeks to get them in. And the recommendation is go to www.regulations.gov. You go there, and what you'll find at that site is a list, all open proposed rules. And go in there and look for docket number US CBP.2020-0042, and that's where you submit your comments. I think they'll still take paper and ink ones. So if you want to type them out and print it out and put it in the mail and send it off to the agency, they'll accept that too. But I think the preferred method is do it online via regulations.gov. How long can your comments be? There's no limit. they can be one sentence or they can be a whole book, whatever you like. Probably a whole book is not going to get much traction. So make them concise, make them to the point, and make them precise in the sense that have them relate to different sections of the advanced proposed rulemaking. Okay. And here's some final thoughts. This is, in my opinion, this is a done deed. This is going to happen. So if you think this, you should not be required to have continuing education, this is a bad idea, you can always send that comment in, but I don't think it's going to go anywhere. So I think this reading the advanced proposed rulemaking, I would say this looks to me like it's going to happen. So it's a non-starter if you say it shouldn't happen at all. Just looking once again at the advanced notice of proposed rulemaking, the way it appeared in the Federal Register, it seems to be very well thought out. And so in that regard, it looks like a complete document, and it's, I would say, at least 80 or 90% of the way there to the final product. So, but you still have a chance to shape it and make it something that you can live with and comply with. And don't be shy about submitting comments. You're not going to be put on FBI's watch list or anything like that. They actually welcome your feedback and suggestions. So don't be shy on suggesting. Submitting your comments, submitting your recommendations, give them your thoughts. So don't be shy, send them in. And with that, I'm done. So I think what I do now is stop sharing.
Yeah, you're not done yet, Bruce. We got questions. We got
to the questions.
Yeah, we got
Shall
questions.
I leave this up to while I do questions?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead and leave that up. Go ahead and leave that up. So one person asked, Melissa asked, it sounds like a realistic time frame for this would be effective the next triennial reports in 2025. Would you concur? Would you make any guess about timing regarding activating this proposal?
I think activation probably is a year to a year and a half off from now.
A year and a half. So next triennial.
Yeah, they have to go through this advanced notice proposed rulemaking, then a proposed rulemaking, and then a final rule, and then an implementation date. So that sounds to me like a year, year and a half, even though it looks like a fairly complete document.
Okay. Cindy asks, so firms applying to be an accreditor can also be trainers as long as they're accredited by a different firm than themselves. Is that correct?
Yes, exactly. So you can be an accreditor and a provider at the same time. You just can't you just can't accredit your own classes.
Interesting. Okay. So another question I sort of had as I looked at this is the and someone asked if the PowerPoint presentation will be forwarded to all registrants, and yes, it will. So be rest assured there. And this is also being recorded for inclusion on the Foreign Trade Association's YouTube channel. But so in the NCBFAA, for example, as a likely accreditor, I get my CCS accreditation each year. Do you anticipate that I would simply show my CCS accreditation as evidence of my training, or would I need to show the classes that I secured or took each of those 3 years?
I'm going to put on a CBP hat and say, show me the classes. Well, for every 3 years, basic requirement, you just check the box. But then if they ask for proof saying they're CCS accredited, in my opinion, that would not be sufficient in the sense that the NCB FAA may have different standards than CBP for continuing education. So CBP would want proof that you met their requirements.
Okay. Okay. And another question is, if CBP is accepting only 5 to 10 firms for being accreditors, what kind of stringent requirements do you think will be required to be chosen? What if they get 20? Any ideas on how they might vet that down to 5 to 10?
Well, in the Federal Register, the Customs said they had no limits, either a lower limit or upper limit of how many creditors there could be out there. So you could have 20. I would say it's kind of an awkward situation, and I would anticipate you wouldn't wind up with that many, but it could be that many, meet the requirements, and I can back it up here.
But hopefully you'd have more than one because they couldn't accredit themselves.
Yeah. That's a good point. You have to have at least two, but there's no limit on how many there could be, but they have to meet these requirements. And so how many training companies and associations and other providers could meet all these requirements? I don't know, but they'd have to. And I guess if CBP felt that there were just too many out there, they could really strictly interpret these requirements and kind of cull the number down in that manner by not approving them in the first place.
Okay, I see no more questions on the chat. Anna, could you unmute and see if anyone has any questions or raise your hand if you have a question you'd like to ask a question verbally. Okay. I don't see
no questions on my end here, Mark.
I don't see any either. So again, thank you, Bruce. And I might add, Bruce actually was a teacher of my customs broker license prep class 30 plus years ago. So thank you for that, Bruce. And again, thank you for today. Thank you to Brawlmauer Law Group for your sponsorship. And remember, if you'd like to join the FTA, although there are some conditions and restrictions, if you haven't been a member of the FTA in the last 18 months, or you're an individual who left a company that was a member, you are eligible for our special 50% off promotion. So regularly $600 down to $300, or individual from $300 to $150. So sign up or inquire on our website today. Again, go ahead.
And Mark, I'll just mention, I've been a member of the FTA for 40 years.
Wow.
And I remember one of the first events I went to was they had a big seminar in downtown, I think it's Biltmore. They had a big seminar downtown LA, what was used to be called 807, item 807 of the harmonized tariff. That's now 9802.0080 U.S. goods assembled. And there must have been 100 people there. And they had people from customs there and a couple of attorneys and all that kind of stuff to a panel. And I went to it and I thought, this is a good event. And I don't think I was a member at that time. And I went back to my company as used in those days and said, hey, we need to sign up for the Foreign Trade Association. So I think if you're not a member, be aware that the FTA does, hopefully we'll get back to doing live events, in-person events in the future. The FTA offers a lot of value for a lot of folks. Not only the seminars and webinars they hold, a lot of it is just getting to know other people who do the same thing that you do. And sometimes the association can be a good matchmaking opportunity or benchmarking opportunity. Another war story from the past, when I was at Boeing, I remember the woman I reported to, the director, she would come to me, she went to me several times, she said, Bruce, we need to benchmark with another company on such and such. Do you know anybody who we could benchmark with? And I always came back and said, yeah, about this one and that one. They're all people I knew through the foreign trade. So it's a valuable thing to belong to.
Yeah.
Mark, back to you.
Thank you. And we've, like I said, we've got some upcoming events to add to that value. The centralized examination station webinar on December 8th. Dr. Noel Hasagaba from the Port of Long Beach speaking about the logistical benefits of the bridge to everywhere. And again, the 2021 winner of the Marjorie Shostak Award will be revealed. KPMG, excuse me, is going to have a forced labor event January 8th, and another blockchain and emerging technologies later in January. So again, thank you for your participation and continued support. We'll be sending out a copy of this presentation to everyone. And thank you again, and have a wonderful afternoon.
And back to the beach.
Back to the beach.